How you set up your terrain may be the most consequential decision you make in your games of Legions Imperialis. A good setup encourages tactical and thoughtful play, while a bad setup can result in a negative experience for both players. Today, I'm going to show you my method for how I set up my tables, which has proven to be an effective way to generate board layouts that produce tense and balanced games. The core Legions Imperialis rules recognize three separate methods for setting up terrain: alternate placement, where the players take turns placing a single piece of terrain; collaboration, where both players organically design and create a table together; and single player, where one player places all the terrain on the table and the other player chooses the mission. Each one of these methods has its advantages and its disadvantages. Alternate placement is very formal and gives a lot of control over the terrain setup, but it does take time. Collaboration is great for producing a narrative and aesthetically pleasing table, but it can result in unbalanced tables. Single player setup is much quicker, but may also result in either player being dissatisfied with the terrain or the chosen mission. My personal preference, which I'm going to discuss in this video, is for alternate placement, but with a few tweaks. I don't keep too much contact with Warhammer 40,000 these days, but I do know that player placed terrain is a bit of a taboo subject, to the point where I believe most tournaments simply use fixed terrain layouts that are predetermined. While I understand the desire to ensure balance, I think that choosing the ground on which he fights is the most important function of a general. Removing that choice from a wargame just doesn't really feel right to me. Player placed terrain, when done right, encourages tactical choices and planning. And the method that I'm going to suggest for you in this video, I think, will produce those effects while also limiting any possibility for abuse. This may be obvious, but the first thing you have to do is to decide how big of a table you want to use. And as I've shown in this chart here, anything less than 1,000 points should probably be played on a 3x3 table. Anything around 1,500 points, maybe 4x4, and so on, increasing the table size as you increase the amount of points in your game. Restricting the size of the table for smaller games is going to make sure that both players really have to interact with each other rather than dancing around the table, hunting for unattended objectives that the players just can't defend because they don't have enough units. After you've chosen your table size, you need to select a mission. At this point in the life of the game, we have quite a few missions to choose from, with a significant variety of objectives and deployments. I highly recommend that you make use of all of these missions as much as possible. A large mission pool will encourage balanced army building, as an army list will need to be able to handle a variety of situations. If you only play a few missions regularly, unconsciously or not, your armies are going to become optimized for the missions that you play. And not only is this unrealistic, but it quickly becomes boring as well. The core rules recommend 1d3 plus 1 pieces of terrain per table quarter. For the same reasons that I recommend a variety of missions, I also recommend that you occasionally change up the terrain density as well, as this will further encourage army list diversity in your playgroup and prevent abuse generated by the ability to optimize armies and army lists for different terrain conditions. Now, I just said that we want to be placing a certain number of terrain pieces per table quarter. But what does that really mean? How big is a terrain piece? Well, there isn't a solid answer in the rules, but there are some clues. The rules for structures say that a large structure is about 6 inches by 6 inches in footprint. And smaller structures should be placed in clusters to make up what is collectively known as a terrain piece. Thus, I've taken this to mean that one large structure on its own is equivalent to one terrain piece, and therefore a terrain piece should be about 6 inches by 6 inches. This naturally raises the question of what constitutes terrain. I've made a whole video about terrain, which you can reference, and of course, the rulebook covers many different kinds of terrain in detail. But the key thing that I want you to remember is that you must have a strong collection with plenty of variety. You want to have terrain available to you that will block movement and line of sight, and that also privileges certain unit types over others. A dense urban board is going to be great for infantry heavy armies, while difficult terrain gives walkers a big advantage over vehicles. As with mission type and terrain density, a variety of terrain is going to enrich your games and make them more tactically interesting. All right, now that we've decided how big the table will be, how much terrain you're going to use, let's divide the table into quarters. And this is important because these table quarters are going to be how we allocate and place every piece of terrain on the table in the steps that follow. The key difference between the normal alternating method and the one that I'm suggesting here is that we assign two table quarters to each player by a roll off. The player who rolls highest gets to choose two of the table quarters diagonally from each other, and these are the two table quarters into which he will place terrain. Next, each player rolls to determine how much terrain will be in each of their table quarters. Exactly what you'll roll has already been decided when you chose the terrain density. And once the number of terrain pieces have been determined, the players are going to alternate placing all pieces of terrain in their assigned table quarters. Here you can see that player A has rolled a 1 on the bottom left quarter and a 2 on the top right. Player B has rolled a 3 on the bottom right and a 2 on the top left. This means that there will be 2 pieces of terrain in the bottom left, 4 in the bottom right, 3 in the top right, and 3 in the top left. Since player A won the roll off and chose the table quarters, he places terrain first. He chooses the bottom left quarter and places a hill and a cluster of small structures. Player B then takes his turn and chooses to place terrain in the top left quarter. He places a cluster of structures towards the back line of the table, some obstructing terrain to the north of the structures that player A placed towards the center of the table, and then a medium and a small building as one cluster opposite the hill. Player A then places terrain in the top right quarter. He chooses to place a large structure, another cluster of small structures, and a large hill to the south of the quarter, potentially making a strong defensive position for whoever controls that side of the table. Player B has responsibility for the densest table quarter and places some small structures and a large structure to the back of the quarter, along with some obstructing terrain to cut off some lines of fire from the hill to the north. He also places some dangerous terrain toward the center of the table to discourage movement without blocking too many lines of fire. After all the major terrain pieces have been deployed, the players should roll off to determine battlefield control. This is an important step that should not be overlooked. Many times it can be a formality, and players often just choose the table side at which they find themselves standing. But whether the player who wins battlefield control elects to exercise the choice or not, it is important that it is available, since it discourages either player from deliberately sabotaging one of their table quarters. If they lose control of the battlefield, they'll be stuck with it. Now that our major terrain pieces have been placed, it's time to think about scatter terrain. And I think this often gets overlooked, but it's a mistake to do so. Scatter terrain allows each player some additional control over the table and allows them to make up in some way for any weaknesses they've identified in their table quarters. When placing scatter, you could either continue with the diagonal quarter placement that I've just described, which incentivizes more offensive play by placing deleterious scatter to disrupt and discomfit the enemy, or you could restrict scatter to each player's closest table half, which would allow the players more opportunity to use scatter to improve the terrain on their side of the table. I think either way would work fine, and you could even alternate from game to game just to experiment and adjust how you play the game. Just as with regular terrain, it's important to understand what scatter terrain is, and in general, it should be much smaller than regular terrain pieces. Roughly 2 inches by 2 inches seems to work pretty well in my games. Minor generic obstacles like crates, derelict vehicles, drop pods, wire obstacles, minefields, tank traps, defensive barricades, all of these are great examples of what would make good scatter terrain. And again, make sure to reference my video on terrain for some suggestions on rules and effects for each of these types of scatter terrain. Once all your terrain is placed, you're basically ready to start playing. The last thing you need to do is set up your objective markers and determine your secondaries. It's important not to set up your objectives first so that the players cannot place terrain with exact knowledge of where they'll be. After the objectives are placed, make sure to roll for your secondary objectives and then go ahead and deploy, infiltrate, and do your forward deployments. I've found this method to be a very effective one, and I hope that you will too. It preserves the player's ability to influence the course of the battle by clever placement of terrain, but without giving them complete control of a contiguous table half. This discourages abuse, as neither player has a chance to set up an entire table half that will be either advantageous to them or disadvantageous to their opponent. Lastly, by placing alternate terrain by quarters rather than by terrain piece, we reduce the back and forth of the quote unquote true alternate placement method and speed up the game just a little bit, letting us get quicker to the action. So that's how I set up my tables for my games of Legions Imperialis. I've found that it has been very effective at producing tables that are balanced and that encourage tactical and thoughtful play. I hope that you'll give it a try. If you do, make sure to leave a comment and let me know how it went. If you have a different method for setting up your own tables that you think works well, make sure to let us know down in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, please like and subscribe. And that's all for now, Commanders. See you in the next one.